Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ingrid Bejerman, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this extraordinary conversation between two literary titans whose works span continents, centuries, and the boundaries of imagination itself. Simon Sebag Montefiore is a master historian and novelist whose sweeping narratives excavates the complexities of power, love, and empire. Salman Rushdie, a trailblazing literary magician, has redefined fiction with his kaleidoscopic narratives where myth, memory, and magic collide with the real world. Together tonight, we'll explore the spaces between history and dream, between the record and the reverie, and ask, what role does imagination play in creating the stories we tell and the stories we live by? Please welcome Simon Sebag Montefiore and Salman Rushdie. Now, because we're speaking of dreams, I'm going to draw on my Argentinian roots and take a bit of a psychoanalytic approach. So let's start with your childhood and origins of imagination to both. Do you remember the first story, whether read, told, or imagined, that made you realize the power of fiction? How did your childhood shape your imaginative instincts?
You know, if you grow up in India, you are very fortunate because there is this incredible storehouse of fantastic stories. And that is given to you as a gift from your childhood. You know? And in my case, my father never made stories up, but he was very good at retelling the stories of the classical tradition, the animal stories of the Panchtantra, and of course, not only the Arabian Nights compendium, but also in Kashmir, which is where my family originally is from, there's a similar compendium of stories that is even bigger than the Arabian Nights, which is called, in Sanskrit, is called Katha Sarit Sagar, which means the ocean of the streams of story. And there's no ocean, it's a metaphor. But there is a gigantic amount of story, which are all wonderful, crazy, fantastic tales. And so my first encounter with that tradition was through my father's retellings. And, you know, I fell in love.
Simon?
Well, I guess being in a Jewish family is not unlike being in an Indian family, except that all our stories end badly. But otherwise, I also grew up with all sorts of stories. I remember being read The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde and sort of sobbing for hours, and my mother looked at my father and said, "He's got to chill." And then I remember, obviously, we were all brought up on the vicious stories of Straw Peter. I don't know if those reached you, Salman.
Yeah, no, I remember Straw Peter. Nails, lots of nails.
Yeah, lots of nails and fire.
Yeah.
But growing up in my house was like being in a story because my father was a doctor. His surgery was under the house. And so there was regular always dramas. He was a psychiatrist as well as a GP. And so there was generally chaos bursting out of the surgery. And my mother always said to me when I was young, she said, "You're going to see a lot of things. You must never mention a word of what you see in this house, or you'll ruin your father."
And so you became a writer.
And so I became a writer and put them all in books.
There was a point in my life when my mother said that my mother was also a storyteller, but she was a gossip. She knew everybody's secrets. And like all great gossips, she couldn't keep them to herself. And I listened very carefully. And at a certain point, she said, "I'm going to stop telling you things because you put them in your books and I get in trouble." But she didn't stop. But, you know, it's interesting what you say about the stories ending badly, because one of the good things about, for example, the animal fables of Panchtantra, a lot of them are not moral fables in the way that Aesop fables are. You know, those fables, the Western fables, always end up with a little piece of good advice. You know, don't be mean, be nice to your friends, etc., whatever, awful little homilies. These stories are not like that. Very often the bad guys win. For example, I'll tell you one brief story. There's a war between the owls and the crows. And what happens is that a couple of crows decide to pretend to be defectors and to defect to the owl side. So they make friends with the owls. But what they're actually doing is finding all the entrances and exits of the owl's secret hideout. And then they go back to the crows and tell them, and the crows light fires at the entrances and all the owls die. The end.
Well, it's like all the Straw Peters have no redemption at the end at all. But I remember, but the nice thing about my parents was they were very, very, they loved telling stories, and they were very, very tolerant, and you couldn't shock them. So my father, whatever you said to him, when you came back from boarding school, terrible things had happened there, of course, and whatever I said to him, he'd say, Simon, that's perfectly normal. There's absolutely nothing to worry about. It's like whatever it was. And in fact, Dudley Moore and Peter Cook were patients of his, and they did a sketch based on a psychiatrist, where the psychiatrist, whatever they said, the psychiatrist said, that's perfectly normal. So anyway.
Yeah, well, my school experience was different because I really didn't like being at boarding school in England. And so I began to write fiction. My first fiction were my letters home, in which I told them how fantastic everything was, and how I played cricket and scored 24 runs and taken 3 slip catches. And I was awful at cricket. So it's a complete lie. But these letters, my mother kept them. And decades later, she showed them to me. And I looked at these letters and I thought, this is the beginning of a novelist,
Did she believe them?
Yes. Yeah. And then when I actually left school and I finally confessed to them that I'd really hated it, they were incredibly upset. They said, why didn't you tell us? We'd have taken you out. That never occurred to me that I had the option of escape. I thought I was trapped, as children do. You think you're in a place full of rules. The idea that you can escape the rules, it doesn't occur to you. So I suffered 4.5 years when I didn't have to. First mistake.
Okay, so now let's continue on with something simple but vast. What does imagination mean to you as writers? Is it a tool, a landscape, or a force?
You go first.
Well, as a historian, you're not meant to imagine too much. But the key thing about a historian is you have to think your way into the mind of other people. And I think one of the great lessons that perhaps both of us might share is that realizing that people in different places or in different ages may look like us, but their mental landscape can be so different from us, it's as different as us and Martians, or perhaps that's a slight exaggeration. But so when I was writing about Stalin, for example, all the books I read just treated Stalin as a sort of Mephistophelian machine, and none of them had really kind of gone into what it was like to be a member of a tiny terrorist revolutionary organization that used almost a kind of coded Aesopian language, the Bolsheviks I'm talking about, obviously, and who really had no hope of ever winning power, but in the end did win power in the biggest country in the world. And once they were in power, they still ran the Soviet Union like a little kind of sect, a coven of these 20 weird, vicious, brutal, ruthless, interesting guys above a bar in Tbilisi. And they still ran the Soviet Union that way. So that was I guess that's the first challenge of imagination. And it's key to understand that you really don't understand how other people think unless you try and think your way into it. So some humility is essential for historians.
Well, I was a historian too before I was a novelist. I mean, that's what I love my university subject. And I was lucky in that I was taught by some great historians. And in my college, there was this medieval historian called Arthur Hibbert who was a genius but also a drunk. And so he published less than he should have. But amongst the history faculty of the time, everybody knew that he was the genius. Anyway, he taught me a lesson that I've never forgotten. He said, talking about the writing of history, he said, you should not write history, and it's like what Simon is saying, you should not write history until you can hear the people speak. He said, because if you can't hear them speak, you don't know them well enough, and you can't tell their story. And I thought this is great advice for a novelist. And so now, very often, when I'm trying to write a story, I ask myself how the characters speak. Do they have an accent? What's the accent? You know, in England, accent reveals class. In America, accent very often reveals region, you know, or race. That's one question. Do they have a big vocabulary or a limited one? Do they use bad language? Or are they quite clean in their speech? Are they voluble? Or do they not say very much? And once you've answered all these questions, you actually know quite well the person you're talking about, just from answering the questions about how they speak. So history taught me that lesson, which applied very well to fiction. And I mean, I think, you know, a lot of my books have historical points of origin. Sometimes recent history, sometimes much older history. So I think, in a way, that training of being an undergraduate historian, not a professional like this gentleman here, but it has remained with me, you know. And even though my books are, some would say, imaginative, the historical training is underneath all of it.
Well, Midnight's Children is all about.
Midnight's Children is, yeah. I mean,
that's, you know, most historical, isn't it?
There was this terrible joke that my parents used to tell. Because I was born, and 8 weeks later, the British Empire in India ended. 8 weeks to the day. And my father would tell his friends this joke. He said, you know, Salman was born, and 8 weeks later, the British ran away. You know? And I thought, you know, how funny is that? and maybe it's funny like the first time, but like the 101st time, it's less funny. But then, at a certain point, he did me a favor, because at a certain point I thought, I mean, as a writer, I thought, supposing there wasn't the 8-week gap, supposing it was the same day, then what? And that turned into Midnight's Children. So this terrible family joke gave me the starting point for that book. And that book, you know, because if what you're saying is that the child and the country are in some way twins because they're born at the same time, then you have to tell the story of both the twins. You know? And so this book, which I wasn't planning to do anything as ambitious as that. You know, I was trying to write a novel about childhood. That's the starting point. I thought I would, based on my childhood in Bombay, I would write a novel about childhood. But then once I had this idea, sort of kind of history rushed into the book. And I realized I had to write something much scarier and bigger. And it was terrifying. I mean, it took me 5 years to write because I was learning how to write it while I was writing it. And for a long time, I wasn't at all convinced that I could do it. I thought, here's this colossal subject, and it's only me, you know, and I've got to wrestle it to the ground somehow. And I wasn't at all convinced that I would succeed. That's why 5.5 years it took. And by the end of it, I thought, oh, well, I know a little bit more about how to be a writer now. You know, and it's one of the things I've always thought about writing, is that I like to know something else. By the time I finish a book, I like to know something I didn't know when I started the book. So the book becomes a voyage of discovery. And I mean, Midnight's Children was a huge voyage of discovery. And I mean, I learned a lot about history for a start, even though it's my own country of origin. And I thought I knew a lot. But, you know, writing a book, you find out a lot more.
I don't feel like a professional anything, frankly. I don't know if you feel like... I mean, I guess we are professionals because we live by our writing.
Yeah.
But I always remember Napoleon's rather questionable comment. He said, in war, like prostitution, amateurs are often better than professionals. I think that applies to writers too.
So generals, prostitutes, and novelists. Interesting category.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, now let's stay with dreams now in the subconscious. I'll go back to Salman. Dreams often blur into your storytelling, surreal logic, floating symbols, dreamlike narration. Do you remember your dreams, and do they ever write for you?
You know, yesterday at the opening ceremony here, I told a story about a tree in India. It's a true story, but it's a real tree. But I mean, a few months ago, I actually had a dream about the tree. Because when I saw this tree, it was more than 40 years ago. You know, it's a long time ago. But I had a dream, and in the dream, I was the tree. You know, and so that gave me the idea of what I said yesterday about it. Because I do, in some ways, feel like the tree, multiply rooted. You know, like a big spreading banyan tree.
Which happens to be the theme of the festival this year.
Well, that's, yeah, exactly. So I dreamed the theme before it happened. This is unfortunately a failing of mine. I dream things before they happen. Not always a good thing. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to be very careful about dreams in novels because sometimes they seem like it's too easy. You know, anything can happen, and therefore nothing matters. But I did probably the longest dream sequence I've ever written is in the Satanic Verses, and it got me in a lot of trouble, that dream. Made sure it took a long while before I wrote any other dreams. But you know, I thought the dream in the novel. Well, the character who is dreaming is going insane. And his dream is a dream. And in the dream, he dreams the birth of a religion. And the religion is not called Islam, and the place it happens is not called Mecca, and the prophet is not called Muhammad. And this is what we in the trade call fiction. But it was read in a different way. But yeah, there's this.
Or it wasn't read at all.
Well, you know, what is nice is that now, however many years have passed, and the book is finally, people can read it like a book, you know, instead of like a sort of hot potato or a scandal. And, you know, some people like it, some people don't like it, and some people are somewhere in between, and that is the ordinary life of a book, you know, and it's very pleasing to me that the book finally gets to have the ordinary life of a book. You know, there was a point where every taxi driver in the world had an opinion about the Satanic Verses. And none of them had even seen a copy of it, which includes that well-known taxi driver, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Never saw a copy of it. You know, he was on his deathbed at the time. He wasn't reading 600-page literary novels written in English. That didn't stop him having an opinion. So, and I used to be annoyed about that. And then I thought, if you think about books that have been persecuted, it's almost always the case that the people doing the persecuting are unfamiliar with the book they're persecuting. So, you know, when James Joyce was being accused of being a pornographer, it's quite clear that nobody had read Ulysses, because James Joyce had many gifts, but arousing sexual desire probably not one of them, you know. And so on. The people who called Lolita a pedophile text, you know, had obviously never read this extremely moral book. You know. So, and then I thought, well, maybe it's a prerequisite for attacking a book not to read it. Because once you've read it, maybe you have a more complicated relationship with it. You know? So, anyway, yes, you learn lessons as you go through life.
Thank you. Now, Simon, your work is deeply rooted still with dreams in historical reality, yet novels like One Night in Winter, emotional truth often feels dreamlike. Do dreams or the unconscious play a role in how you approach your characters?
Well, it's funny you should say that, actually, because when I was writing Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, which is drenched in blood and filled with just appalling stories of betrayal and execution and torture. I regularly dreamt, well, because Stalin was obsessed with how people reacted when they were executed. He always wanted to be told, what did they say, how did they behave? And so I started to have dreams about how I would behave in those circumstances. Which is, of course, you need to wake up in a terrible, sometimes thinking like I behaved rather well there. Other times thinking like I embarrassed myself horribly at that execution. But it inspired me because one time I remember I was looking, there were all sorts of terrible things in Stalin's archives, which are quite fascinating, that they literally killed people by quota. So sometimes they'd say, kill 10,000 people in Stalingrad or in Kiev or whatever. And then, of course, when they sent the orders to kill all these people, the local leaders, it was really aimed at the local leaders, but the local leaders didn't kill the people they were meant to. So they then come back to Stalin and say, we killed 10,000 people, and then other people would say, but they weren't the people they were meant to kill. So then they'd send the order again. And this is all written on Stalin's notes. So it is very chilling. And so I had that dream. But I remember when I was going through the archives, there were photographs of people who had been arrested. And at one point, I found a photograph. And it was this black and white photograph. And these photographs are quite extraordinary. When you arrived at Lubyanka, you were woken in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning. You were taken there in these horrible black black crows, they were called in Russian. And you were taken to, and then you were signed in, you gave your clothes, you had your belt and everything taken away, you had a medical search, and then you had this photograph taken, in black and white, of course, this is in 1937, say. And it's chilling to look in the faces of these people, because they knew this was maybe the last photograph that would ever be taken. And one time I found this beautiful woman looking back at me. And she was a Jewish woman with 3 children, and she was executed about 4 days after this photograph was taken, for nothing. She was completely innocent. There was actually nothing. And so I thought to myself, I'm going to write a novel about, an imaginary novel about this woman and her family, a Jewish family in Russia, and how she came to this point. And that was my novel, Sashenko, and that became the Moscow Trilogy of novels, which are all sort of based on sort of true stories, but they all come from these horrible dreams. But of course, in history, there's another sort of dream, which is all nations are made from dreams. And all nationalist dreams are normally kind of totally invented, and actually a nonsense, aren't they?
Yeah, well, there's a line somewhere in Midnight Children where one of the characters describes India as a dream that people agreed to dream. And compares it to the 2 other, what he says, the 2 other mighty fantasies, one of which is money, and the other is God. But until the British left India, there had never been a country called India. Because when the British arrived in India, there were many kingdoms. And the British actually never conquered all of them. They had about 2/3 of the country, and the rest of it was princely states. So even at the height of the British Empire, India was a kind of patchwork. And only as the independence movement gathered steam did the idea of how to unite all of it take place. So on the 15th of August, 1947, Independence Day, was the country that became independent had never existed until that day. There's talking of dream, I'll just tell you a strange story. When the Partition Treaty was negotiated, so that Pakistan was going to come into being at the same time as India, it was actually going to happen on August the 14th, 1947. And then the Nehru family have always been obsessed with astrology. So they got an astrologer to cast the horoscope of the nation that would be born at that moment. And the horoscope said, terrible day. Really bad day. and so Nehru asked the astrologer, how about 24 hours later? And the astrologer said, yeah, much better. And so Nehru approached the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, and said, can we postpone it 24 hours? And Mountbatten was very amused. He said, you guys have been fighting for this for 100 years, and now you want to postpone it?
It's hard to imagine what the bad day would have been like.
Given
how bad the good day was.
No, well, we don't have to imagine, because Pakistan, less interested in astrology, said, the hell with that. We want it when we agreed. And so Pakistan became independent one day before India. The Pakistani Independence Day is the 14th. Indian Independence Day is the 15th. And if you look at the subsequent history of the two countries, you can judge whether the astrologers were right or not.
But it's quite interesting when you read Nehru's books that he wrote and everything. He suddenly starts inventing this kind of ancient nation that existed in India. And you're so right. I mean, it never existed.
It never existed.
Even the greatest empires, the Mughal empires, which
never got the whole of it.
Never got anything like the whole of India.
No, there was one moment during the rule of the sixth and last of the Grand Mughals, or Aurangzeb, when his army came down into South India and very briefly reached the tip and then retreated. But as the army retreated, the Mughals lost control immediately. So it was never, a lot of the south was never in the Mughal Empire. Nobody has ever managed to rule the whole of India until the 15th of August, 1947.
And it's very interesting because, of course, we now think that all the countries that exist now are terribly ancient countries. And of course, they all have, talking of dreams, they all have these irredentist dreams of how these nations were created. And if you look at the Middle East, for example, there's never been a Syria, there's never been an Iraq, there's never been a Jordan. I mean, none of these countries have ever existed before.
No, and even at a more local level, if you look at maps of of Manhattan Island from half a century ago, there's no Tribeca. There's no Dumbo. There's whole regions of the city which simply didn't exist. I mean, the places existed, but they acquired their imagery later on. And of course, America itself is the New Jerusalem. I mean, the city on a hill. This idea of being special, being somehow a model for the world. Imagine that. But America is born out of a dream, or at least was constituted out of a dream. It was born out of Tea Party.
Marie-André, how much time do we have? Just 10 minutes.
Oh,
but
really?
Okay, so I have 10 minutes and then the question period? Perfect.
Okay.
So give me a second because I have a lot more than yes. Let's see.
We'll give short answers.
Let's see. No.
Yes.
I love the storytelling. Let me see which question I have to choose from mine before the public. Let's see. Where could we go?
While you're thinking,
second, I want to make the good.
Let me say, I mean, two of the books that I've written that I'm actually most pleased with are both historical, real ancient, I mean, not recent history.
So let's go with that, historical fiction, the history and the dreams.
I mean, a long time ago, I wrote this novel called The Enchantress of Florence, which was about the Mughal Empire and the High Renaissance. And what struck me is a very interesting thing that both of those periods were moments of colossal cultural advance. Of course, we all know about Florence and the great Florentine artists and the philosophers, the birth of Western humanism and so on. Very similar things happening in India, both philosophically and artistically. And yet these two cultures, as far as we know, had absolutely no contact. Absolutely. I think there's records of about 2 Westerners, one English person and one Italian person, arriving in the court of the Mughal Empire and being treated fairly casually and without much interest. And yet there they are, both at cultural peaks, and both very similar kinds of cultural peak. And so I thought, okay, so that never happened, the connection. So what does a novelist do? You make it happen. You know, you invent the connection that didn't exist in order to dramatize, if you like, the similarity of the worlds. So I did that. But I remember, you know, when I was very young, before I'd published a novel, I was traveling in South India, and I visited the ruins of a great South Indian empire, the so-called Vijayanagara Empire, that ruled over a lot of South India in the couple of centuries before the Mughal Empire. So middle of the 14th to middle of the 16th century. And I thought, you know, even in India, people don't know very much about the Vijayanagara Empire, except certain parts of South India, people do know about it. I thought, I'm growing up in India, why do I not know about it? You know, so I tried to find out about it. And when I was writing The Enchantress, I remembered, I thought, yeah, there was that place in South India, that was really interesting. And so I thought, maybe I have to some point write a book about that. And this ended up much more recently. I mean, many years after I wrote the first book, I wrote Victory City, which is the name Vijayanagar. Vijaya is victory, Nagar is city, so Vijayanagar is Victory City. And I feel with those two books that they kind of feel to be like a unit, like a pair, you know, like a... There isn't a third one to write, otherwise it could be a trilogy, but it's a trilogy with only two books in it.
Trilogy of two.
Which is like, you know, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I remember Douglas Adams wanted it to be a trilogy, but then he wrote 5 books. And they're on the 5th book, it's called Book 5 of the Hitchhiker Trilogy.
Yes. Well, I must say, even though I love my history books, but I especially love my historical novels because they're about the private life of people. They're about the secret life, the intimate life. My books are all about power, which is a cold medium, while family life is the stuff of fiction and love, which is a warm medium. And so I've loved my time spent there, and I'm proudest of those books. The last one was the most fun to do in a way, because the first two were sort of so kind of tragic. But the last one was when I discovered that in 1942, when Hitler advanced across South Russia, he used a huge amount of cavalry to cross the steppes. And the Russians also used a huge amount of cavalry. No one knew this, because everyone always imagines the Second World War was all about tanks. But they actually had millions of horses. And the Italians were there, and they had huge amounts of horses. And of course, the Romanians, who were even more primitive, had even more horses. So there were these huge cavalry battles. Wow. So I had the idea of doing a Western on the Eastern Front. And so that's what Red Sky at Noon is. But the second one is of an even more bizarre story, which is like one of Salman's stories almost, but it's set in the grim Bolshevik world instead of the wonderful world of the Renaissance and the Mughal Empire, which is that when I was interviewing one of Stalin's leaders' sons, he said to me, of course, that was the year that I was arrested in my pajamas once. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, once when I was 12 years old, I was at our dacha, and I went out in my pajamas from my parents' house, and 2 kind of cars drew up, and they took me away in my pajamas. I said, really, what happened? And he said, like, well, I didn't come back for 6 months. And we were Stalin kept us prisoner, and of course all my brothers and all my friends were arrested too. And so that was the first I discovered of the children's case, it was called, where in 1942-33, Stalin arrested the children of all of his leaders and accused them of launching a children's coup against the Soviet Union. And so it was a fascinating story. And some of them, I know we're short of time, but some of them were used against... You have time to elaborate. Go ahead. Some of them were used against... Some of the children were very strong and they were extremely careful what they said. But other ones tried to be helpful and offered information that was fatal for their parents. And some of them, while trying to be... some of them hated their parents and actually betrayed them. So children act very differently under this great pressure. And the rule was in Stalin's circles that no one was allowed to ask... You didn't ask Stalin. Stalin loved dealing with people knowing that their children were in prison. And in the end, they were all released unhurt. But but they exposed various things that Stalin used against them. So it's just and that's One Night in Winter, the second.
Well, there are things that sometimes history gives you as a gift, which are better than things you can make up. You know, for example, the greatest Mughal emperor, the great Akbar the Great. One of the stories about him is that he married a Hindu princess, and this was an indication of his syncretist ideas of, you know, unifying Hinduism and Islam and not persecuting either, and so on. And she's very famous, his Hindu wife, until you start looking at the historical record, where there's no evidence of her at all. There's no evidence that he ever married anybody of that name from that Rajput princely family. She's a fiction. She's a fiction that's got lodged in history, and everybody believes it. Yes. If you ask in India, everybody will tell you, yeah, sure, of course, but she never existed. So in The Enchantress of Florence, he's married to an imaginary woman. He imagines her and then believes that she's his wife. Now, I couldn't have made that up, you know. I mean, history provided this, and I'll just very quickly, since we're talking about communism, there's a great image on, I think, the first or second page of Milan Kundera's novel, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, where he talks about a photograph of the Politburo on the balcony in Moscow on the Red Square. And one of the leaders of the Politburo is standing next to whoever it was, not Brezhnev, earlier than that. Anyway, someone no, before Khrushchev. But anyway, it's winter and it's cold, and this particular leader lends the glorious leader his hat, so that the glorious leader is wearing his colleague's hat, and then the colleague is disgraced. And in all the official photographs, he's erased. And all that remains of him is his hat.
Almost happened.
Yeah. So, you know, history and fiction not so far away.
No. And again, well, to end my part with the Argentinian front in Argentina, I mean, you really can't tell the truth. I mean, with the... Yes, the desaparecidos also is very appropriate, but especially with lots of things about Evita Perón, her death, especially what happened to the body, you know. But anyway, we're short on time, and so Marie-André, you'll help me with the quick Q&A? Perfect. Mine is the one with the cords, so I think we need the... Yeah, perfect.
No, we'll have to answer.
Yeah, no, but his is cordless. Yes, he can share. Perfect. Yes, perfect. Excellent.
So this is the Q&A. We have maybe 10 minutes for that. Now the question is for the media. I'm sorry about that for you, but the media has something to say, and this is the only opportunity for them to ask their questions. So, who's going to start? Who's going to start? You? Okay. Short questions and the answer to tell who do you want to answer the questions?
And one question each?
Yeah, one question.
Thank you so much, you both. This has been a real pleasure. I'm Lior Schertzer from the Montreal Gazette. And this is based on something Mr. Rushdie said, but both are welcome to answer. Canadians kind of famously have had a weak national identity, but in response to the annexation threats from the United States, or I guess in reaction, Canadian nationalism is the strongest it's been in my lifetime, and many people older than me say the same. I guess, what do you make of the growing nationalism in a country where it was historically absent? And do you think it's helpful in handling the threats of the US?
I kind of like Canada the way it is. I mean, I remember hearing Robin Williams made some jokes about Canada. And I remember him once saying, Canada is like this great apartment, this beautiful apartment upstairs from a great party. I think right now the apartment looks a bit nicer than the party, you know. So I'd stick with the apartment if I were you.
There's a big difference between nationalism and patriotism. I'm always very reluctant to embrace nationalism. So I kind of agree with Salman there.
The very odd word, nationalism, because there are contexts in which it's been a very positive force. For example, the growth of the nationalist movement in India is what ended up getting rid of the British Empire. And I can see that as a kind of almost entirely positive thing. But there are other parts of the world where nationalism has become associated with more primitive kinds of right-wing politics and so on. So it's a word that you have to be careful about.
Okay. Just name yourself.
Benoît Dutrisac, bienvenue à Montréal. Merci d'être avec nous. We're talking about imagination. Imagination can be dangerous. Is it worth it?
I don't know. What else would I do? I mean, I think actually, as novelists go, I've had quite a good ride. I mean, there's been some bumpy parts, but on the whole, I mean, it's now, where are we, 2020? It's more than 50 years since I published my first novel. And most of that's been very fortunate. And so I don't think there's a problem with it. I think, imagination is the only weapon I've got. I'm not good at anything else. If I was good at something else, I would do it. The only other thing I ever wanted to do is I wanted to be an actor. And you did too? Well, maybe we should start up.
Let's go on the road.
Let's go on the, yeah. But every so often I get offered a little cameo in this or that, and I always say yes. So I was in Bridget Jones's Diary.
And Curb Your Enthusiasm.
And I was in Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yes, that was great.
And then something you may not have seen, there's a film called Then She Found Me, which was the directorial debut of the Oscar-winning actress Helen Hunt, and Helen Hunt also acted in it. And I had the important role. It was a wonderful cast. It was Helen Hunt, Bette Midler, Matthew Broderick, Colin Firth, and me. And I played the central role of Helen Hunt's gynecologist. And because I believe in method acting, I had to go to a real OBGYN and learn how to work an ultrasound machine, which I now know how to do. So if anybody feels they need a checkup, I'm available.
One question, you or no?
Hi, my name is Sophie Durocher. It's very moving to be in the same room as you today because for so many years we cried at what happened to you. And now we can laugh with you, and I can't tell you how important it is for us to be here today and to thank you for being here. So,
well, thank you so much.
I wanted to start by saying that.
Thank you. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, 2.5 years ago was a bad audience.
Yeah. Indeed.
You look like a better audience.
Yeah. Let's hope so.
Yes,
I brought my copy of Joseph Anton with me, and on page 453, you say that you were determined not to allow the darkness to prevail. When you look at what's happening in the world right now and what happened to you personally, do you think that darkness is prevailing?
Ooh, how long have you got? I mean, of course, it's easier to see the many very difficult things that are happening in the world right now. But one of the things, I don't know about you, Simon, but one of the things that the study of history taught me was that there's nothing inevitable about history. History doesn't run on tram lines, and enormous changes are possible at very short notice. And if we'd been sitting here on this date in 1989, and I said the Soviet Union will not exist by the new year, you would have thought I was mad.
Or had a good imagination.
Yeah, or had some inside information. But in fact, that's what happened. This thing which looked like it was just fixed and there, suddenly the wall was falling. you know, and so enormous changes at short notice is I think, that doesn't necessarily mean things get better, they can get worse. But at least it means that change is constant. Things change. And so, and sometimes we can change them. You know, I think we have to, I think one of the few positive lessons of having been a child of the 1960s is that you were given this belief that by your direct action you could change the world. And I think that's maybe a lesson not to forget.
One question over there.
Thank you to both. Leila Malouf, La Presse newspaper. Question for Mr. Rushdie. Do you find it easier today to write on certain subjects with time? Do you find it easier to get inspired by certain subjects?
Look, you know, it gets harder. It doesn't get easier. You know, well, I mean, I've published 22 books. There's a 23rd one coming. It's not easy to think of the next one, because the thing that I dislike most is the idea of repeating myself. And to find the next direction, to find the direction to go in that you haven't gone in before, you know, that doesn't get easier. That gets harder. You know, it doesn't. I'm not complaining. I just think that's the nature of the job. And I don't know what's next, actually. If you've got any good ideas, let me know.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Richard Martineau, Journal de Montréal. You talk about imagination and dreams, both of you. Do you think that we're losing something, that people take novels too literally? That we lost the capacity to perceive humor, irony, second degrees, dream, imagination, metaphor? We take everything literally now, you know?
Yeah. That is the great tragedy of social media. I mean, there is no irony on social media. I mean, there was always a lack of irony on texting because there's no tone. But on social media, it's a sort of hellish arena which must resemble a sort of hell, because isn't hell a place with no sense of humor and no irony? And so that is social media. So I'm more and more disconcerted by, and I want to spend time talking to people. Don't you agree, Simon?
One of the best decisions I made about a year ago was to delete the Twitter app. So I just don't have it. It's an incredible release not to have that noise in your head every day. You know, you don't need it. It doesn't change your day. Your day gets much nicer. You just don't think about it. And I think this may be a generational thing, because I think young people feel the need to be plugged in that way. I don't. You know, my view is I've got friends, and I've got books, and I've got things to think about, and I've got all kinds of things that I don't need to include the President of the United States writing ungrammatically in all capitals.
Stop, Vladimir, stop.
Exactly. Yeah. It's difficult to respect a man who has bad grammar.
Okay. One last question, if there is. Oui?
Okay, I write it down. Yan from Radio Canada. I have a question for both of you, because I read this quotation from philosophy called, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history." Or the only thing we learn from the history is that we don't learn from history. Do you agree with this statement, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that. I think it's the human capacity to not learn things, especially things they really should learn, is inexhaustible. So I do think, I mean, otherwise, maybe we wouldn't repeat the mistakes so often. I mean, to take only recent history, the second election of Donald Trump. If you have the example of the first presidency of Donald Trump, that you should learn from that. But instead, everybody learned the wrong lesson. You know? And now you get all these statements in the press of kind of buyer's remorse. You know, people who voted for Trump finally regretting it. I think, well, a little late. You know, but anyway, I don't want to talk about him.
But I agree. I mean, I think I'd go even further. I'd say not only do we not learn from history, but the human ability, even compulsion, to self-mutilate and self-sabotage is almost endless. And we're seeing that in America now, the most powerful, prosperous state that's ever existed, destroying itself. So I think you're absolutely right. And the struggle is to write history books that capture this. But that's the theme of my world history. The big theme of it is the inexhaustible ability of civilizations and groups of people to destroy themselves for no reason.
Yeah, nobody learns anything.
No one knows anything.
Thank you, Salman Rushdie. Thank you, Simon Sebag Montefiore.